What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors meets one of television's most ruthless hosts, and the cameras keep rolling as everything falls apart? Tonight, we're diving into the shocking confrontation that left Denzel Washington walking off Stephen Colbert's Late Show set, and what you're about to hear will change how you see late-night television forever. It started like any other Tuesday night taping. Denzel Washington, promoting his latest directorial effort, settled into the guest chair with that familiar calm confidence that has defined his career for decades. The audience was electric with anticipation. This was supposed to be a celebration, a victory lap for an artist who had just delivered what critics were calling his masterpiece. But Stephen Colbert had other plans. "So Denzel," Colbert began, his trademark smirk already forming, "I have to ask about something that's been bothering me. You've built this incredible career playing these moral characters, these heroes, but I'm curious about the disconnect between your on-screen persona and some of your real-world choices." The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Denzel's expression didn't change, but those who knew him well could see the slight tightening around his eyes. This wasn't in the pre-interview notes. "What disconnect would that be, Stephen?" Denzel replied, his voice steady but measured. Colbert leaned forward, sensing blood in the water. "Well, you've made millions playing characters who stand up for justice, who fight against corruption. But your production company took tax breaks that some might say came at the expense of working-class communities. How do you reconcile playing the hero while potentially harming the very people your characters fight for?" The audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the playful banter they expected. Denzel set his coffee mug down deliberately, the clink against the glass table audibly, sharp in the suddenly tense studio. "Stephen, I think you might want to check your facts before you start making accusations," Denzel said, his voice carrying that distinctive edge that moviegoers knew meant trouble was coming. "My production company operates within the legal framework that exists, and every project we've done has employed hundreds of people, many from those same communities you're suddenly so concerned about." But Colbert wasn't backing down. If anything, he pressed harder. "Legal doesn't always mean ethical, though, does it? I mean, tobacco companies operated legally for decades while poisoning people. Wall Street operates legally while destroying lives. Just because you can take advantage of tax loopholes doesn't mean you should, especially when you've built your brand on moral authority." The comparison hit like a slap. Denzel's jaw tightened visibly, and for the first time in his decades-long career, television audiences were seeing him genuinely angry in real time. The Denzel Washington they knew from interviews was gracious, thoughtful, diplomatic. This was something else entirely. "You want to compare me to tobacco executives and Wall Street crooks?" Denzel's voice remained controlled, but there was steel underneath now. "You want to sit there in your comfortable chair, making jokes for millionaire network executives, and lecture me about ethics? That's rich, Stephen. That's really rich." Colbert's smirk widened. He was getting exactly what he wanted. "I'm just asking the questions that I think our viewers deserve answers to. You put yourself out there as this moral voice, this conscience, of Hollywood. But when we look at the business side of Denzel Washington, it tells a different story, doesn't it?" "What story is that exactly?" Denzel leaned forward now, matching Colbert's energy but with an intensity that made the host's theatrical aggression look like amateur hour. "The story where I've employed thousands of people over 3 decades? The story where I've funded scholarships for kids who look like me to go to college? The story where I've donated millions to churches and community centers without ever talking about it in interviews? Is that the story you want to tell, Stephen?" The audience was dead silent now. This had moved far beyond uncomfortable television, into something that felt genuinely dangerous. Colbert, however, seemed energized by the tension rather than deterred by it. "But that's exactly my point," Colbert continued, his voice taking on that sanctimonious tone that had made him famous. "You do all these good things, but then you also work within systems that perpetuate inequality. You can't have it both ways. You can't be the conscience of America while also participating in the very structures that keep people down. Denzel stood up abruptly, and the movement was so sudden that the cameras had to quickly adjust to follow him. The studio audience gasped audibly. In 30 years of late-night television, nobody could remember seeing anything quite like this. "You know what, Stephen?" Denzel said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his authority and rage. "I've been doing this for longer than you've been alive, and I've never, not once, had a host try to ambush me like some kind of gotcha journalist wannabe. You want to talk about systems that keep people down? Let's talk about television hosts who make their careers by tearing down black excellence whenever it gets too comfortable for white audiences." The words hit the studio like a thunderclap. Colbert's carefully constructed smirk faltered for just a moment, revealing something uglier underneath before the mask snapped back into place. But Denzel had seen it. That flash of genuine malice. And now he knew exactly what he was dealing with. "Oh, so now we're playing the race card?" Colbert said, his voice dripping with condescension. "That's convenient, isn't it? Anytime someone asks you tough questions, you can just cry racism and shut down the conversation. How very predictable." The audience recoiled at the comment. Even Colbert's most loyal fans in the crowd seemed stunned by the naked hostility in their host's voice. This wasn't comedy anymore. This wasn't even good television. This was something much darker. Denzel turned slowly to face Colbert fully, and anyone who had ever seen him play a villain in a movie recognized the look that crossed his face. It was the same expression he wore right before he destroyed someone's world. "Race card?" Denzel's voice was dangerously quiet now. "Stephen, let me explain something to you since you seem to need an education. I've been in rooms with presidents, CEOs, directors, producers, and every single one of them knew how to show basic respect during a conversation. You're sitting there, making six figures to tell jokes written by a team of writers, and you think, that gives you the right to lecture me about ethics and morality?" Colbert tried to interject, but Denzel wasn't finished. "No, you had your turn to talk. Now it's mine." The authority in his voice was absolute. "You want to know what's unethical? What's unethical is inviting someone onto your show under false pretenses, then ambushing them with poorly researched accusations for your own entertainment. What's unethical is using your platform to tear down a black man who's spent his entire career trying to lift people up, just because it makes for good ratings." The host's face was reddening now, his composure cracking under the sustained assault. "You don't get to come on my show and tell me how to do my job," Colbert snapped back. "I've been asking tough questions long before you decided to play director. Maybe if you spent less time lecturing people about respect and more time actually earning it, we wouldn't be having this conversation." The insult hung in the air like poison gas. Denzel stared at Colbert for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of decades of experience dealing with men exactly like this. "Earning respect?" Denzel said slowly. "Stephen, I've won 2 Academy Awards, a Tony, and a Golden Globe. I've directed films that have touched millions of lives. I've built a career spanning 4 decades without a single major scandal or controversy. But you're right. I clearly need to earn the respect of a talk show host who makes his living mocking people for applause." Colbert's face twisted with something that looked almost like hatred. "Your awards don't make you immune to criticism. Your success doesn't put you above questions. And your race certainly doesn't make you untouchable, no matter how much you want to pretend it does." The second reference to race sent a visible shock through the studio. Even the crew members, who had seen everything in their years of television production, exchanged worried glances. This was career-ending territory for any host, but Colbert seemed too caught up in his own anger to realize what he was doing. Denzel nodded slowly, as if Colbert had just confirmed something he'd suspected all along. "There it is," he said quietly. "There's what this was really about. You see a successful black man sitting in your chair, being celebrated for his achievements. And something inside you just can't stand it, can it? So you decide to tear him down, to remind him and everyone watching that no matter how much success I achieve, there's always going to be someone like you ready to put me back in my place. That's not what this is about, Colbert protested, but his voice lacked conviction now. He was starting to realize that he'd miscalculated badly, that he'd picked a fight with someone far more intelligent and experienced than he'd anticipated. Isn't it? Denzel pressed. Then explain to me why you didn't ask Tom Hanks about his tax situation when he was here last month. Explain to me why you didn't grill Meryl Streep about the ethics of her investment portfolio. Explain to me why it's only when the black guest sits in that chair that suddenly we need to have deep conversations about moral responsibility and ethical business practices. Colbert opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. For the first time since the interview began, he seemed to realize that he was losing badly, that every word out of his mouth was only making things worse for him. You can't explain it, Denzel continued, because we both know what this is really about. This is about you using your platform to humiliate someone you see as getting too comfortable, too successful, too respected. This is about reminding me and everyone watching that no matter what I accomplish, there's always going to be someone like you waiting to tear it down. The studio was dead silent except for the hum of the cameras and the barely audible whispers of crew members who couldn't believe what they were witnessing. Colbert sat frozen, his famous quick wit apparently having abandoned him completely when he needed it most. Denzel straightened his jacket and looked directly into the main camera, speaking to the audience at home rather than the man who had invited him here under false pretenses. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what happens when television hosts forget that their job is to entertain and inform, not to destroy and diminish. This is what happens when someone mistakes cruelty for cleverness and thinks that tearing down their guests makes them look smart. He turned back to Colbert, who was now visibly sweating under the studio lights, his usual composure completely shattered. The host tried to regain control of his own show, but it was too late. Denzel Washington had taken command of the room with the same authority he brought to every role, every scene, every moment of his legendary career. You know what the really sad part is, Stephen? Denzel said, his voice now carrying a tone of genuine disappointment rather than anger. I came here tonight genuinely excited to talk about my work, to share something I'm passionate about with your audience. I respected you enough to clear my schedule, to sit in that chair, to treat you and your show with the professionalism I've shown every interviewer for 30 years. And this is how you chose to repay that respect. Colbert finally found his voice, but it came out as a desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage he'd created. Look, Denzel, maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. Why don't we start over, talk about your new film like we originally planned? The suggestion was met with a look of such pure contempt that several audience members visibly flinched. Denzel's laugh was cold and completely without humor. Start over? He repeated. Stephen, you just spent the last 10 minutes trying to destroy my reputation on national television based on half-researched accusations and barely concealed prejudice. And now you want to start over? You want to pretend this didn't happen and go back to the safe, comfortable interview you should have conducted in the first place? The host's face was now completely red, sweat beading on his forehead as he realized that his attempt at damage control had only made things worse. I was just doing my job, he said weakly, asking the tough questions that journalists are supposed to ask. Journalists? Denzel's voice rose for the first time during the entire confrontation. Stephen, you're not a journalist. You're a comedian who got lucky enough to inherit a time slot. Real journalists do research. Real journalists ask questions based on facts, not rumors and innuendo. Real journalists don't ambush their guests with personal attacks disguised as hard-hitting questions. The comparison clearly stung, and Colbert's mask of professional composure finally cracked completely. You think you're better than me, don't. You? He snarled. You think because you've won some awards and made some movies that you're untouchable? Well, newsflash, Denzel, this is my show, and I'll ask whatever questions I want to ask. The outburst revealed everything. This wasn't about ethics or accountability or any of the high-minded principles Colbert had claimed to represent. This was about ego, about a host who couldn't stand being outclassed by his own guest, about a man who had let his own insecurities turn him into something ugly and small. Denzel stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute moral authority. You're absolutely right, Stephen. This is your show. And what you've shown tonight, what you've revealed about yourself in front of all these people, is that you're willing to destroy your own integrity and damage your own reputation just to try to tear down someone you see as a threat to your ego. He began walking toward the edge of the set, but he wasn't done talking. You had one of the most respected actors in Hollywood sitting in that chair, ready to have a genuine conversation about art, about storytelling, about the craft we both love. Instead, you chose to turn it into some kind of personal vendetta. Based on research you clearly didn't bother to verify and accusations you couldn't support with facts. Colbert made one last desperate attempt to regain control. You can't just walk away from this, he called out. You can't just leave in the middle of an interview. Denzel stopped and turned back one final time, and his smile was colder than anything he'd ever brought to any villainous role. Watch me, he said simply. The two words carried more power than any lengthy speech could have managed. They were a complete dismissal, a rejection not just of Colbert's authority, but of everything he represented. The host sat frozen in his chair, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, as one of Hollywood's biggest stars walked away from his show and his cameras. But Denzel wasn't quite finished. As he reached the edge of the set, he turned to address the studio audience directly, his voice carrying clearly through the dead silent room. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize that you had to witness this tonight. You came here expecting entertainment, and instead you got to see what happens when someone in a position of power abuses that power to try to humiliate and diminish their guests. This isn't what television should be. This isn't what interviews should be. And this certainly isn't what respect looks like. The audience began to applaud, slowly at first, then building to a thunderous ovation that seemed to go on forever. It was clear that whatever Colbert had hoped to accomplish, it had backfired spectacularly. The audience was firmly on Denzel's side, and their applause felt like a judgment on everything they'd just witnessed. Colbert sat alone at his desk, his face a mask of humiliation and rage, as Denzel Washington walked off his set with his dignity intact and his reputation enhanced. Rather than damaged, the host had tried to destroy a legend and had succeeded only in destroying himself. As the applause continued and the cameras kept rolling, capturing every moment of Colbert's public humiliation, it became clear that this wasn't just the end of an interview. This was the end of any pretense that Stephen Colbert was anything more than a small, petty man who had been given a platform far larger than his character could handle. The cameras finally stopped rolling, but the damage was done. In trying to tear down Denzel Washington, Stephen Colbert had revealed exactly who he really was, and the world had been watching.